Welcome to Legacy Conversations, a channel where we preserve military memories and history.
Well, greetings everyone on the net today. Hey, my name is Chris Kuma. I've just recently joined Legacy Conversation as a presenter. I am very thrilled and excited today, and I know that sounds like Koos's line, but in this case I genuinely am, because today we've managed to secure another session or a chat with Hawker Hunter pilot Steve Murray. Steve ran a great interview session with Legacy back in August last year. If you haven't seen it, I would strongly urge you to Google it. It's well worth your time. Fascinating stuff. So by way of introduction, Steve has a very lengthy and rich career flying jets. So as I mentioned, with the Rhodesian Air Force, Hawker Hunters, and of course with the South African Air Force, Flying Mirage 3s. However, today he's going to share the next part of his aviation journey, as well as his time as a civilian pilot with QANTAS. So without further ado, we'd like to welcome Steve.
Thank you, Chris. It's good to be back again. And this is sort of an extension now, which I didn't anticipate, of my aviation careers, particularly to do with the Hunter. And I should mention, in my previous interview, it was quite extensive, but I should come back and talk a little bit about the Hunter. I actually became interested in the Hunter when I was 15, 1963, when they arrived in Rhodesia. And at that stage, that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to fly the Hunter. I eventually worked as a technician only on the Hunter and the Hunter simulator for 4 years before doing my pilot training. And then I went straight onto the Hunter, and I've been back several times. And I said that'll be in the previous interview. But what is interesting is that flying for QANTAS, and I was at QANTAS for 21 years as a captain on the 737 trainee captain and check captain. And in the middle of that, in the early 2003, I got to fly the Hunter again. A friend of mine bought one. It took 7 years for us to get it going again, and I got the endorsement. And I'll mention that right now because Australians have what they call an experimental category, in which case, with the right experience, they will allow you to jump in and fly an aircraft. And that was I hadn't flown a Hunter for 20 years at that stage. The previous time I'd been in Somalia. But I just jumped in. I did 3 flights, did the flight tests, and then did the endorsement training for the chap who owned it. And then I went back down to Melbourne, where I was based. I flew out of Brisbane with the Hunter. So I mention that right now because I've now been retired from the airline for 13 years now, and still flying helicopters occasionally in Tasmania, where my friend owns a couple of Bell 47s. But and all I do now is my virtual reality flying the aircraft I never had a chance to in the Air Force: F-16, F-18, MiG-21, MiG-29, and flying off ships and that, but not flying actually at all a fixed wing. And then out of the blue, after that interview that I did with Koos, a chap, Loris Besson, bought the book that my sort of autobiography that Koos had advertised on the show, and Loris enjoyed the book and got hold of me, and we sort of started corresponding. And then out of the blue, this would go back about 5 months now, he suddenly said to me, listen, they've got a Hunter here at this International Test Pilot School in Canada, where he occasionally lectures. And he said, these guys have asked if you could have a chat to them about flying the Hunter. And that came out of the blue. And I said to him, when I found out what the aircraft was, it's actually a T7, which is a small engine Hunter. It's got 7 pounds of thrust as opposed to the ones I'd flown, which have got 10,000 pounds of thrust. And I'd never flown one. So I told them, I said, I haven't flown one of these aircraft, but if they want to chat, I'm happy to chat. So shortly after that, they got hold of me, and we organized a Zoom. And there were 3 pilots, Tiago, who was the project test pilot, a Brazilian, Alain, who was a French-Canadian test pilot with them, ex-Canadian Air Force, ex-Air Canada, and Dave, who was a an Australian sort of oversaw a sort of a standards type guy for ITPS. And we chatted for 2 hours, and it was quite surprising, you know. And we covered a lot of ground because the engine's obviously different, but the flying characteristics of the Hunter were quite different. And these guys are mainly fourth generation pilots. Mine, the Hunter's the second generation. There's quite a big difference in the type of flying. So we covered a lot of the subject, and at the end of it, I wasn't sure how it had gone down, but obviously after 2 hours, it must have gone down fairly well. Anyway, I contacted, Loris contacted me a couple of days later and said, no, they were really pleased with it, you know, with the conversation. So that was great. And I didn't think much more about it until now it goes back just 2 months. It was just in September. All of a sudden, I got a message from Tiago, who was the project test pilot, sent me an email and said, how would you like to come and fly do the first flight with me on the Hunter? Without a second thought, I just said yes. I'd love to come and do that. And perhaps I should have put more thought into it, but still, I just accepted it. And from then, things sort of went on from there. Bearing in mind, I'm now 76, so I also surely realized that I wasn't their first choice for someone to go and fly with Tiago, because this was the flight test and the first one that I'd done. So anyway, I said, yeah, I'd love to do it. And they said, well, now we're going to try and get your license. And at that stage, I've got a class 2 medical, and I'm actually not endorsed on anything at the moment. And that's not a problem, because I was involved with the Hunter here. In fact, the one that I talked about earlier is now was now about to fly. It's another story, which was we need to not to go into now. But basically, the CASA here, the people authority, said all I had to do is I got my medical sorted out. I just had to go and do a flight in the single engine aeroplane. It could be anything, you know, Cessna 172 or something like that. And if they call it a flight review, it's not a flight test as such. And if the guy was happy that I could jump in the Hunter. So that's where I was. I didn't have a license, but I had my medical. So anyway, I sent all my information across to Tiago, and they obviously approached the Canadians. Now, at this stage, the Canadians haven't got an experimental program like category like we have. They have in South Africa, and they've also got in Australia and probably other countries. So they required a pilot in the right-hand seat who was a pilot in command. In fact, that's what they was classed as, a pilot in command, to fly those first flights. And it sort of came down to be a sort of safety pilot, and I'll explain why later on. But anyway, I was pilot in command, and that's what their requirement, which was good for me, because now there was my chance to fly. Anyway, I got my license, and the license I currently hold right now is a Canadian license attached to my airline transport pilot license, Australian one, to fly that particular aircraft. So I'm very proud of my Canadian license now I've got, even though it's only for that Hunter. And so that was now established, and I could go. They then contacted me, and they said, well, now we've got all that sort of stuff. We will send you an agreement and a contract, and how much do you want to get paid? And there was another surprise for me, because this is the type of thing I normally have done for fun before, you know. But and I said, I don't know what to pay you. There must be some sort of industry standard, and they were very obliging and sent me a contract with a comfortable payment and airline tickets. So now I'm about on my way. Within 2 weeks, I think I was on my way, because I had to get all this endorsement stuff out, and flew across Sydney to Los Angeles and then to Toronto, when I was picked up by them. And from then on, it was, I can't say enough, because it was such a professional exercise for me, you know. And I'm saying that coming from being in the military and also being in QANTAS, which was an amazing airline as well. And this is along the same lines, extremely professional. And I ended up in the hotel. Loris actually came and saw me, made sure I was settled in. My friend who I'd been in contact with, we had a bride the next day at his place. And then on Monday, Tiago came and picked me up, this young Brazilian, I say young Brazilian, 40-year-old, and he was half my age sort of thing. Very experienced pilot. He's a Brazilian. He's headhunted by the owner, who I'll come to shortly, from Brazilian Air Force. He did his training in the United States Navy pilot training school. He flew F5s, T-38, F-16s, F-18, Mirage 2000, all part of his test flying. He's flown 51 different kinds of aircraft. But we had this immediate rapport, you know. everybody got him, we just got chatting, and we just got on well. He was so down to earth. And I should mention here, because now we're driving to the test pilot school, I think, I'm sure pretty certain that as pilots, we look at test pilots as just perhaps a cut above us. To become a test pilot, you basically have been advanced and above average pilots. And then you've got to be smart enough to go through the rigmarole that they do. I've seen, even in our little Air Force in Rhodesia, I saw go through that sort of test pilot exercise, which wasn't nothing like this one, but the amount of study and mathematics that went into it. And anyway, so I arrived at the place now. It's a big setup. They would have about 15 to 20 training test pilots. These are all from other air forces. And then they would have students who were between 20 and 30 test pilot students there as well. And I walked into this mix and I just found just a lovely bunch of guys, down to earth, if I can say that, no ego, and especially with Tiago, with these sort of experience, and just a lovely guy, man. So that was so refreshing to go into that environment. Anyway, we had to sort a couple of the domestics. I think I get a work permit sorted out. I actually got to see Niagara Falls because of it, which was nice. I've now seen the three biggest waterfalls in the world. Iguazu in South America, obviously big falls, and now Niagara. Anyway, I got all that sorted out, and then I got to meet the boss. Now the boss is Giorgio Clementi. He's an Italian-born South African. Okay, no, sorry, South African-born Italian. That's the other way around. But obviously a really bright guy. He joined the South African Air Force as an engineer. He went on to be a test engineer, a flight test engineer, and then I think when he left the Air Force, he then went into the fixed-wing side of flight, pilot side of flight, and eventually he did 41 years in aerospace, of which 30 were flight testing, and another 29 were training test pilots. And he bought this company in the UK, and then shifted it across to Canada, and he's the owner. And it's a big organization, and all of these projects which I'm going to talk about there are all his brainchild. Basically, he's thought with all the stuff. So obviously a very, very bright guy. And when I went in to meet him, and I'd done the same with Tiago, we had a chat, and he said, I've seen your interview, probably the one, that Legacy Conversation. He said, are you for the Mirage 3? So I said, yes. He said, oh, I want one of those. He said he always wished he'd flown the Mirage 3. And so we talked about the same sort of subjects. But at that stage, I said to him, as I said to Tiago, I realize, I'm not here because of my superb skill in being a hunter pilot, but only because you have to have me. And that's true. As I said earlier on, the Canadians required someone to be, in fact, they required two pilots, the one to do the flight testing, as I did, and the next one to do the training of these pilots, and they had to be with a Class 1 medical. Anyway, I said to Tiago and also to Georgia, I know I'm here just to put a tick in the box, but I'm really excited to be here because I'm flying a hunter again, And they said, well, you're welcome. I'm sure you'll be able to part some information. And as it turned out, as we'll discuss a bit later, I was, surprisingly, because I try to keep as low key as possible. I'm surrounded by all these bright guys, and I haven't flown an airplane, a fixed wing airplane, for the last 13 years. But I seemed to fit in. It was really nice. So from then on, we had to, as once again, following the whole professional aspect of this, is I had to be fitted out with my flying overalls, G-suits. We had another waistband here that came around here that had to connect with our oxygen tubes and that type of thing. And now the game was on, because I'm at least 10 kilos more than I'd like to be, well, more than I was as an airline pilot and fighter pilot. In fact, I was even lighter as a fighter pilot. But I thought, this is going to be fun. So the suit went on, the G-suit went on, and this fancy new helmet went on fine. And then I had to go and get briefed on the ejection seats. And that was very professional, done by Stephen Jacobs, who was ex-SAAF and also ex-Thunder City. Very professional. The seat was out of the aircraft, and we went through the whole process. It's quite a complex strap-on. I've done it before in the Mirage similar seat, and also in the Mirage, the later Mirage, and the later Hunter. But that all went well. And then, so now I'm fitted. Now we go to the airplane. Now, the jet fighter variety is not a very big cockpit. So once again, climbed up into the cockpit, sat down comfortably, went through the whole, but then that's when this big change came for me. The cockpit is completely different from anything I've ever seen before. It's a complete, in fact, I'll tell you what it's called. It's the whole system is called an SEA. It's 5th generation surrogate training aircraft. And what that means is that they've made the whole of the right-hand side basically a 5th generation jet. The HOTAS controls, which means you can control everything from your throttle or your thrust lever and from your control stick, and so you can do all the switching from there. It's hands-on throttle and type of thing. So that, and in front of me, in the right-hand seat, was just a big screen from a 5th generation type aircraft where you can actually plot targets on there, shoot them down, and with the data linked with the ground. So instead of having to go and buy a 5th generation jet, which is basically an F-35 or an F-22 or the equivalent Russian one, which is now the Su-57 or something, they can actually have a guy in the right-hand seat operating all this stuff as if it was a 5th generation aircraft, with Tiago or Elaine, the two hunter pilots, just flying the aircraft on the left-hand side. But also being tested. I mean, they're still training these test pilots when they move on to a 5th generation jet. Most of the guys were F-16 pilots there, F-18, still some Phantom pilots, probably a couple of F-35s, because all the training, the students there were really from all over the world. I met Turkish, Canadians, Dutch, Koreans, South Africans, RAF. So these, and plus more, there's some of these other Brazilian blokes I didn't even recognize, you know. Were all these different people there, and they're coming from all different aspects of flying, or different types of flying, and this is just one aspect of it, the 5th generation, and it gives them a whole new aspect to flight testing, without having to spend $80 million to go and buy a 5th generation jet. So it was really interesting, but. And so now sitting in this Hunter now, which meant the only two things I recognized was the undercarriage button and the flap lever. The rest was completely different. The other thing as well, and the Hunter originally was a DC aircraft with DC batteries, and with an inverter, a lot of the instruments were actually AC. Now they've done away with that completely. They took out the inverter completely. Now it's only a DC machine. And this is, once again, this is Giorgio's whole brainchild. He's got two or three very smart electrical engineers who worked out how to do all that, take out the inverters, make it a DC machine, and to drive these two instruments in front of the pilot, the two interchangeable flight instruments, engine instruments, sitting in front of him with the master caution panel, which we never had in Hunter. Hunter, if you look for your emergency warnings, they're all over the cockpit somewhere, but now it's all sitting up on a panel here. And it was out of this world, amazing. It was completely unrecognizable for me. Just to describe how some of the changes affected us, though, on the original, on our legacy Hunter, I call it a legacy Hunter that I came and fly, had a beautiful air conditioning system. Because it's a small cockpit, it's easy to keep it cool or warm or whatever you want. And it was AC control. So if you wanted boiling air coming in, it would do that. If you wanted ice thrown at you, it would do that. And it was just a matter of moving the switch. But that was AC. So when they chucked it out, we know how to use an emergency. Well, it's not really emergency, it's just an alternate system. If your AC packed up, you could use the DC side of it. And that just moved another lever, which moved the valve inside, which caused us a couple of problems because we didn't know how far to move it to make it, either hot or cold. And I'll come to that a bit later. But that's the type of thing that completely changed in the aircraft. And I just found that fascinating. It was just to go through the whole thing. There were a couple of other things on it as well, which we didn't get involved with. All we were doing is actually doing the test flights for the first couple of test flights. It's got it's a helmet-mounted display. So I think I've sent you the advert for our first flight, and you see Tiago sitting with a little thing in his eye here. That is basically the modern F-16s have a whole head-up display here on the helmet, and it looks quite cumbersome. And these guys have designed just a single little eye thing. That's a head-mounted display, And then they've got, as I said, the data link training with the big screen, which was in front of me. Now, the interesting part about this, it all had to be done in-house. It took 4 years to get this up and running. And the technicians, the electrical guys, worked out what should be done. And then they had 2 airframe guys, basically, airframe engineers. One of them was from the South African Air Force, really, really smart guy. He actually rebuilt those Lightnings and the Hunters in Thunder City. Still a young guy, relatively young guy, probably in his mid-40s. And between them and the electrical guys, they made this cockpit what it was, okay? And so now we had a big discussion about that, and now we were prepared for the flying. And it's professional again. They got these classrooms all around, they're not very big ones. And in each classroom, you've got this big TV screen. And all the briefing and everything comes up on that. The weather comes up on that. NOTAMs have noticed about problems with air traffic and that type of thing, all come up in this board. And so we have these very in-depth briefings before we went flying. And to begin with, there was just the taxi test, and he had taxied it before, but he wanted to test this. Shoot, this is a Tiago. And all our flying was done, everything we did initially was done early in the morning, because the air traffic control were worried about, because we wanted to stay close to the airfield. First flight in 4 years. The aircraft probably hadn't flown for 10 years, I don't think, in total. It come from Sweden or something. But anyway, it's all, we strapped in the dark, taxied out, and did the taxi, fast taxi. The chute worked and all that sort of good stuff. But I mean, at this stage now, I'm beside myself, because I'm sitting in the aircraft, getting strapped into this thing, of not having done it for so long. Yet it was so familiar, the smell of the Hunter. The instruments weren't familiar, but the smell of the Hunter and everything was just, it was seventh heaven. Anyway, after the first taxi test, Tiago decided that in true test flying circles, you have a chase plane. So to come and take the photograph of everything, and everything falling off, whatever, they could take photographs, which is they always do with test flying. Something I'd never done. In Rhodesia, we just wrote everything down on a board. In South Africa, in the Mirage, we would have but there wasn't really test flying. It was just after maintenance, we would just do a test flight. But here, it was serious stuff, because the aircraft being completely rebuilt. And they went through it exactly the way the normal test program would go. So we did the next morning, we did a flight. I sat in the back of an L-39 with Tiago in front, and then we had the chase plane pilots who were Dave, the sort of overseeing standards guy, and behind him Elaine, he was going to be the Hunter pilot. And we did this flight, and we went, checked everything, the gear, the speeds. We had to go make sure the speeds were the same on both aircraft as it would be in the Hunter. So that was the next day, and then the following day was going to be the day we were going to go and be the first test flight. And it was a lot of excitement, because especially from Tiago's, not Tiago, from Tiago, but from Georgia's point of view, because it was his sort of brainchild, and Tiago's pressure was on him, because he's now the project pilot. For me, I was just having fun. Anyway, we went out first thing the next morning. There was a Friday, and we went out in the dark, and we checked the weather, and there was a bit of mist, and apparently that happens quite often in that part of the world. So we went out, sat in the aircraft, did the whole strapping and everything. And by that stage, Tiago and I were working really well together. We bounced stuff off. We had actually quite a lot of laughs along the way. And it was just easy the whole thing was just easy and professional. And the techs were really switched on. Obviously, they knew the aircraft intimately. Anyway, we taxied out the sun was about to come up, and we saw all this mist in the distance. And the target said, "Oh, that might be a problem." But as we got onto the taxiway, before we entered the runway, the mist was off the runway. And so the photographers got these amazing shots of us taking off. So it all went off like clockwork. The L-39 took off first. He came up behind us. He gave us a hack call. And as he was, I think, 30 seconds out, Tiago went to full thrust. And then as he said, gave 5 seconds to go, released brakes, and he took the whole photograph of the takeoff, and away we went. And the flight was just exactly as we'd done the day before with L-39, checking gear, going down and up. We were flying on this lovely sunny day, spring day, and the it's London Airport, and it's about 100 miles west of Toronto. And the Great Lakes are down there. You can see all the Great Lakes in the distance. Beautiful farming area. It was just a lovely day. Everything worked tickety-boo, you know. And we came back, and of course, as I expected. The other thing I should mention as well is that in the Rhodesian Air Force, we didn't have two-seaters. So whenever a guy went to fly a Hunter, Hunter got very light controls. And whenever a guy went to fly the Hunter, everyone used to come out to watch, because as he got airborne, there'd be this waggling of the wings, because the manual controls in other aircraft, you've got to work quite hard to move the controls. Whereas the Hunter was so light, except for the helicopter pilots. The Allo pilots were very light controls, so they flew off quite nicely. But Tiago, steady as a bird, you know, his sort of experience was just, it was fine. Come back to land as well. I told him he annoyed me because he did a grease on his first landing. So that wasn't fair. So I said to him, that's not fair. Anyway, the parachute worked, and they didn't have to use the parachute again. It was just to make sure it worked. The last long runway, we taxied back in, and of course the whole of, in fact, on our taxi out, most of our TPS were there in the dark to see us go. But coming back in, the whole place was, all our TPS people were there, and especially Georgia was beside himself. He was, really excited. You can see the photographs. We got out. Poor old Tiago got dumped with water on his side. The bucket of water on my side was okay. I got away with it. But just nice photographs, from. I just felt so good. It was and everything had gone really well. Nothing had gone wrong at all. And we had a nice meal afterwards. And the Beverly, who's Georgia's wife, very lovely lady, and she seems to keep everything really relaxed. She used to come and help with feeding and that time. She would organize some lovely breakfast for us in the hangar, and all the RTPS engineers, pilots, and the students all there, and came and had a nice meal. It was just lovely and successful, and that was the good thing about it. It was just everything had just gone the way it should do with an output like that, despite the age of the aircraft and the complete change in its technical side. Anyway, from then on, I did another test flight with Diogo, but in fact, on the second test flight, we dispensed with the chase plane because the L-39 couldn't keep up with us. Whenever we were doing some sort of flying, he couldn't keep up. So, and the aircraft was in such good nick that Diogo said, "No, we don't know." So we went up and did another test flight, the similar sort of things. Now, bearing in mind, this was really interesting because it's not just me scribing or anything like that. I had a great big computer sitting down next to me, which picked up all the information that was happening in the aircraft. We had GoPro cameras all around us, which you can see from some of the recording. Plus, I was also scribing as well, so he could coordinate all these different information that was coming in. So we did the second flight again, and once again, nothing went particularly wrong. We then had a slight problem. It was on the third flight, maybe. I think it was off the it was after the second flight. We had a problem. The oil pressure, there was a residual oil pressure on the engine, and the engineer, the surfing guy said, "No, we can't fly. This has got to be zero. There's no oil. The engine's not going to be zero." It turned out to be an AC problem, AC-DC problem, because it used to be an AC gauge, and they put a DC on the new system, and the DC sensor wasn't really designed for the sort of temperatures around the engine. And that was a bit of a problem for a while. That was the only thing that gave us a problem, actually. Eventually, he was able to wrap it in and keep the heat off the sensor, and it worked okay. So that was sort of the major problem we had. The second flight was just the same. We just went through the same sort of procedures again. But I remember by that stage, I sort of was come down out of the clouds a bit. And I just, as we flew climbing out, I said to Joe, I just cannot believe at my age and this sort of stage of my life, I'm sitting in a Hunter here and just enjoying everything about it. The speed, we started putting a bit of G, and the G suit filled up, because I hadn't felt that for about 40 years. And we flew upside down. That might be on the third flight. We had to fly upside down with negative G to see if they made sure that fuel could continue to transfer. There's an accumulator for about 15 seconds of fuel, and then you've got to come out and the fuel goes normal. We did that upside down. And the beauty for the engine, from our perspective, from the engineers, how good they were, there was no dirt in the canopy as well, because when in the Air Force, when you flew upside down negative G, everything was on the floor, ended up on the canopy, and dust and bolts, perhaps, I don't know. Anyway, ours was completely clean. So that was really exciting. You know? And then we came back and we landed. He did a couple of circuits, and that one, of course, annoyed me again because they were perfect. Good landings and the rest of it. And he'd never flown this aircraft before. And I just remember getting out of the aircraft at that stage and having a chat to the engineers. Having been a technician engineer myself, I was instruments, but whenever I wasn't flying, I'd be out there with engineers just chatting and talking about the aircraft. So they're always working on different aspects of the aircraft to make sure everything was okay. It was in immaculate condition. And but I remember after the second flight, I think it was, I thought to myself, I should have thought a bit more about this. You know, when they asked me to come and do this, you know, I just jumped in. After having, and it was very technical what I was doing. And the fact that, you know, I wasn't sure if I'd fit in the cockpit and that if you could remove all the controls, if I was flying upside down, if I was going to get, you know, the G, everything. And I thought, no, I'm pleased I just did it. I didn't even have a second thought. I just did it. Then after the second flight, another really good thing happened as well. We were driving somewhere. Tiago was take me to, I think, to a barbecue at the boss's house, the owner's house. And he said to me, out of the blue, he just said, I spoke to my wife today. I said to her, I couldn't have had a nicer bloke sitting in the seat beside me. And and I said, funny you should say that, because I just written to my wife this morning on email and said to her, I'm having a blast. This guy is such a lovely guy. He's so easy to fly with. There's so lack of humble is it's probably too strong a word, because I don't think there are too many really humble pilot pilots, but he certainly had no ego, and he was just easy to work with. So that was where we were after the second flight, and then we did another flight, and that was just tidying up things, you know, for the. I have to mention at this stage, Tiago is having to write a report. These test pilots have to write a report all the time on what they do. That report for the first flight took a week. So I remember saying to him at one stage, with tongue in cheek, I said to him, I'm glad I was never smart enough to be a test pilot, because I seem to spend your life on the computer writing reports. But it's just, they're very dedicated to what they do. And once again, we come back. I'm a dyed-in-the-wool jet pilot. No apologies for that. I've always wanted to fly jets. I was lucky enough to fly jets, and I'm still flying them with my virtuality. But I was in jet pilot heaven. Now, the F-16, the Vampire was the first generation, Hunter was second, the third generation was the Mirage, the fourth generation the F-16. Now, I never got a chance to fly this because we didn't have them in Africa for one, and I was too old. But I'm surrounded. I was sitting in my desk where the bloke was on holiday was here, and next to me was a Romanian MiG-29 pilot. Yeah, lovely guy. He is full of nonsense, like as they all are the Balkans. They lots of character, you know. His wife is also a test pilot for the helicopter. Next to him was Tiago, my pilot with the Hunter. Next to him was another Brazilian, but I think flying L-39s. Over the counter were two helicopter test pilots, I think they're English, an Israeli ex-Israeli Air Force test pilot. And sitting in front of me, is an F-16 pilot who flew a thing called the Saab Draken, which I always loved as growing up as a kid. I just loved the look of it, and I'd love to fly it. You know, I'm a firmly believe that jet fighters are something you should strap on. You know, you don't strap, you strap them on, and it's just a radar, you and a huge engine behind you. Know, when it got to F-15s, funny enough, the F-15s never really appealed to me because it's the size of a 737, for goodness sake, you know. And anyway, it's a beautiful aircraft, obviously. But to me, the F-16 was going to be, I just always enjoyed that. And then, so this is what I'm surrounded with. I can speak to all these guys. They all want to speak about them. They're just easygoing. So that was really fun. And then she was off the second flight. They sort of called, the Canadians that told you had wanted a pilot to do the flight testing. I mean, that was acceptable with me with a class 2 medical. I could still do it. But to do the endorsement flying, they wanted someone with a class 1 medical. And at that stage, they were going to fly. We had a couple of bad days of weather. They were going to fly me off to Vancouver, where there was an Australian-based or Australian doctor, aviation doctor with Australian to endorse Australian pilots. And they were going to try and use me to do the endorsement flying as well. Anyway, that sort of came to know. The Australians obviously said, no, you can't do that. So they had lined up another pilot from Europe, F-16 pilot, who flew a private hunter there. And they'd organized him. And so it happened that he came across. So after the weekend, after the second flight, he arrived there, and on Monday morning we met him. Once again, a lovely mid-50s F-16 test pilot in Europe, and had flown the Hunter. So, and just fitted in with the three of us. Now there are four of us flying this Hunter. So I did the last flight of my test flying, and then after that, this guy then flew with them, starting with the left-hand seat, and then Tiago had to do 10 hours with him, and he did about 8 hours with Elaine, the other pilot. So now you could now endorse them, and Elaine would become the trainer of the Hunter. Anyway, but during that period, which I wasn't flying, I just kept on chatting with the techs, the engineers, and that type of thing. But there were a couple of other aspects of this ITPS, which I need to talk about because it's not related to the Hunter, but very fascinating. The first was one day we were walking past. I was with Tiago. We walked in the hangar. There's a hangar full of airplanes, choppers, and L-39s, L-29s. And Tiago happened to say to me, well, I saw this really funny-looking low wing piston engine airplane, side by side. He did something like a Piper, but really horrible-looking thing. And I said to Tiago, what on earth is that? He said, that airplane is terrible. And it's perfect for us because these test pilots be under training have to fly 15 aircraft for that first year that they're there and evaluate them and how to correct their deficiencies, I suppose. And of course, that aircraft being as bad as it is, there's a lot to work with. As I should actually mention that these test pilots, when they're there, they come away with a degree in it's called. I want to get this right. A Master of Science in Flight Testing degree. That's what it's called. It's a Master of Science in Flight Testing. The degree is, and so the spectrums have to do 15 aircraft, and the helicopter pilots do 10, and they evaluate 10 aircraft. Then he said to me, but there's something more interesting over here. He said in the corner over there, there's an aircraft, and it's an L-39, and it's on jacks. And it's out in the corner. He said, that's going to be a fly-by-wire. Now, the only fly-by-wire aircraft you have at this stage are like some of the modern airliners, and the F-16 was probably the first one of the fourth generation. Now all of them are fly-by-wire. But once again, Giorgio's brainchild, because this aircraft with fly-by-wire, they take out all of the normal manual controls, and they put in the wire. From the control stick goes into a computer, and it comes out through the wires to electrical servos out in the wings or the tail and the elevator. And now on a particular day, the first day, for example, they just tweak in, this is how an L-39 flies. And then the bloke goes up and evaluates it, comes back, and the next day they tweak it. So now it's very unstable in longitudinally and that's stable laterally. So now he's got another airplane. So you now can evaluate that. And then the next day you can do it again. So, and they've called it, it's a L-39 Advanced Controls Evaluator. And so that's what it's doing. Basically, it's just they can make it fly any which way it wants. So that was really, at the end of the day, that was probably the most fascinating thing I saw was actually this thing. Then they've got one other step, especially in the context of what's happening in the world today. They've got a long ease. I don't even know the long ease. It's a home-built aircraft well, they've turned it into a drone. And so now they've got this drone, it's a drone, and they've got a whole room somewhere where the pilot for the drones and the test pilot students to fly this drone. They have to have a pilot in it. The Canadians require it, but he sits there. He doesn't do anything. So they got this drone thing going as well. So that's the next thing, and especially when you hear so much about drones at this stage. And then the other one, which was another day I had, I've got this mixed reality set of mine here with the controls, and I've got a very good headset, and I have a lot of fun with that. And the bloke said, you must come and see our one. Now, this is DCS World. I don't know if you've heard about it, but they do this. They set up. Well, the one they've got is DCS World on steroids. It's a commercial. Like we get it for free here, but their one, they pay for it. And I went into this room, and there would be at least 6 F-18 cockpits. And you've got a photograph there somewhere of me sitting and flying this thing. Now, the difference is with my one, I've got to bind my controls to the either the throttle or to the control stick. Whereas there, with this DCS World one that they've got, it's a commercial one, you can actually press all the buttons work. All the controls, everything works. So I was flying through the Koos in Russia, and it was just amazing. The virtually same headset as mine. In fact, the resolution is still not perfect. And even mine was not too far behind it. But it's the fact that you could touch everything in it. And once again, they're teaching a strategy to test pilots who can go back and then do the same when they get back to their countries. And a lot of those sort of Southeast Asian type countries who've got Sukhoi 30s or whatever it is, and MiG-29s, and they're involved in that type of thing. So those 3 particular aspects I really enjoyed, even when I wasn't, just seeing what's going on there and how much they're developing all the time. And once again, goes back to Georgia. He's a brainchild. He's obviously thinking the whole time about new stuff, to do. Anyway, then at the end of that, the guys, when the pilot from the European pilot finished flying with doing their training, I went back into 3 more flights, one with the Tiago and the 2 with the Lane, the other Hunter pilot. And we're just doing testing at that stage. And it was, I was only supposed to be there 2 weeks, and eventually Georgia said to me, listen, we need a backup of some sort. So I was there actually a month, which was fantastic, Yeah, really, really good time. I spent quite a bit of time. He invited us to a couple of rides at his place, Georgia. And that's nothing which really surprised me in Canada is best steaks I've ever eaten. I've been to Argentina, South Africa, Australia, and I've just these big steaks, and they were just cut through like butter. And it wasn't just the way they were being cooked. I went to several different places, and they were all the same. So there was another huge plus for me. Yeah, so it was fantastic. I just don't want to miss anything about that along the way. But it was all that. And so after I actually did about 8 hours eventually, and they gave me my T-shirt, which was nice. And the other thing I should mention is that when I got my flight overalls, they all wear them to work, and they're going to town to buy at the grocery store. They go in these things, and this orange thing, first thing my daughter said when she saw it, she said, "You look like a criminal." And so, so I came out of, and even the guys, I'll say that with that, it was justification because the blokes there told me that their children say the same thing whenever they come out of the you look like criminal. I came out of a pizza store one day, and there were these 2 old ladies looking at me, and I said, "Yeah, I've just broken out to come and get a pizza." So when I showed them my RTPS badge, they were a bit more happy about it. Yeah. But yeah, that was a part of it. And I handed that back, and I wasn't going to be sure about me walking around Australia with my orange flight suit on. Yeah. And that was about as far as from that aspect, the training from the flying side. I was put up in a lovely hotel. They gave me a car to come there, but everything was just, I can't emphasize how professional it was, how relaxed it was. Everyone seemed to get on, and I feel that had a lot to do with Georgia's wife. She just made everything easy. She used to come in quite often. We'd be in a crew room. There might be up to 30 of us, 20 to 30 of us having tea, whatever it was, and she'd be there. She'd bring a cake sometimes, and everyone obviously speaking English. It was easy to and I mixed as much as I could with the other pilots because I wanted to hear what aircraft they were flying and what they were doing and that kind of, so it was very, very interesting, very interesting. Yeah, and then I came back, and there was a chap in South Africa who's got 2 hunters, He had them at Thunder City one stage. He was given them by the Swiss years ago. The Swiss gave their hunters away, basically. And now those, at least 20 of them are flying in the States, hunters, okay? Now, it's a company called ACAC, and they use them as red air, which means they are the enemy. And the hunter is very fast, low level. It can do 620 knots, which is you're getting up towards supersonic low level. It's very easy to maintain. And the guy who's the chap who set up a company to maintain these aircraft and got the contract with the United States Air Force who leased these aircraft from him, he's a Canadian. And Lawty Aviation's it. And he's actually now servicing engines. He's probably making spares. And these aircraft have been flying for over 20 years now in the USA. And they're used more and more different aspects. They actually take them apart and send them to Germany, to Japan, and they do that stuff there. And where he does the aircraft actually registered in the States. He hasn't even got a runway where he services them in Canada. The aircraft are that easy to take apart, maintain, do the maintenance, take them and put them together, do the testing, take them apart again, and send them to the States. The Hunter's now 70. The first flight was in 51, so it's now 72 years old. And I think that's amazing. And they'll be flying when they're hunting. They will be, because this guy set up a company. He's still trying to get hunters around the world because there's a job for them. And going back to RTPS's hunter, because I've been around hunters so long, I own my own hunter, and it's just, I think it's amazing, and it's for the aircraft itself, that this aircraft is 67 years old, and it's the centerpiece of their organization. If you see a photograph of RTPS today, or anyone has a photograph, for example, there were 3 Korean pilots who graduated, and they wanted a photograph of their time before they left. They didn't have a photograph taken in front of the helicopter. They came to me and said, "Can you take a photograph in front of the Hunter?" There's a 67-year-old airplane, it's a centerpiece, and it's in immaculate condition. There's not a bit of dirt on it, grease. I told you, fly upside down, the cockpit's clean, everything about it. So it's a testament to what a wonderful aircraft our Hunter is, and the fact it's still going strong. Sorry, coming back to that. So this guy in South Africa, he's had it over 20 years. He got a 2-seater and a single-seater, and I've been contacted over various times, and he let me taxi his single-seater once. Oh, this is 2011, 12 years ago. And when he through Facebook, he'd sent me something about showing me his aircraft, and I wrote and he'd seen on Facebook that I'd been to Canada. And he said, so now I'm back in Australia. He said, "Have you got an endorsement to train on the aircraft?" And I said, "Yes, I've trained in the Air Force and also Australia." And anyway, he said, "Yeah." He said, he's got a partner with him with his 2-seater. And his partner owns an airline in South Africa anyway. He said he would like to fly the Hunter. Did you train him? I said, "Yes." So now this could come up. He's trying to get me a validation, 28-day validation, which means I could fly the aircraft and train this guy. It wouldn't take long for an experienced pilot. The Hunter is not difficult to fly. It's easy to fly if you keep to the rules. And I'll go back now to Canada. And we're speaking to these guys, like the other 2 guys. Tiago, he's flown all the jets, the fast jets. The other guy also F-16s, and now I've got the European guy with the F-16s, and they're talking about the flying and that type of thing. And when they were briefing amongst themselves after I'd finished my first part of the flying, I just asked if I can go and sit in the briefings. And I tried to sit back and not say too much because, by then it's their game type of thing, and they've been in test pilots and all. But every now and again, they would say something, and I'd say, "No, you shouldn't do that with the 2nd generation jet." Just like on a touch and go, they were touching and selecting flap up and the power. In a modern aircraft with turbo, what you would call a turbo fan, it's got the 2 sets of blades in it. You get almost instant response. In a Hunter, when you're idle and you put the power up, it takes up to 8 seconds to take. So now you're fitting on the flap there, waiting for. And I just said, I wouldn't be doing that, The other thing as well is on downwind, they've had a couple of incidents, and this other European pilot told me, very honestly, which I think was great. He said he nearly got caught out flying the Hunter. He's done about 50 hours now. But he was going downwind. Obviously, he was going a bit fast. So he decided to take his power off and to get the speed back before he started turning in. As he started turning in, now the speed's right, he put the power up. Of course, nothing happened for 8 seconds. And you know, it's a long time, 8 seconds, when you come in, probably in a turn quite close to the stall or something like that. And they've lost a couple of guys, apparently, as I understand it. And he told me, he said he was nearly caught up. And that's what I said at that stage. I said, you know, and I also gave, there were a couple other examples of this aircraft. The Hunter, it was a story in the Middle East where we used a couple of notches of flap to help the turn in a dogfight, also in aerobatics. And if you forget to put the flap up and you accelerate again, the speed will increase and the flaps will blow back up, but not all the way. There might be just that, even though the gauge will show that the flaps up, but they're not. The lever's obviously still in the right place, but there's enough movement of the center of pressure rearwards as your speed increases to put the nose down. To the extent where if you're increasing speed and you try to pull the elevator to pull the stick back, it jackstalls. And there's a story of a Hunter flying straight into the ground in the Middle East. So that, in the small little things like that, in these fourth generation jets won't let you do that. And Mirage, for example, you know, we were well, certainly the Rhodesian Air Force, we didn't have two-seaters, Hunter. So they drummed the sort of stuff into us. Don't get yourself in these sort of situations because it'll bite you. And if it does bite you, it'll spin, whatever. You could probably get out of the spin, but it might take too long. And you've got to eject. If you're going down in a spin, you haven't ejected by 5,000 feet on the way down, you're probably not going to make it. So all those sort of things, we didn't play in spins and stuff because we didn't have two-seater for training. And the Mirage was the same. You had to keep your speed up. Otherwise, it was going to do nasty things. And to give it, to put it in perspective, if you, say, flew a Mirage 3 and just climbed vertically and just let go of the controls, it's going to spin, and you probably have to eject. You know, the spin, you can recover from spin, but the spin looks horrible. It takes a long way to come out of it. If you do that in a Mirage 2000, now Mirage 2000, they went back to the Delta again. That's fly-by-wire, and it's got leading-edge slats and all this sort of stuff. It's all controlled by the computer. So you pull the stick back, and a black read and saw it on YouTube. He got the Mirage 2000, went up, took his hands off the controls, and it just came out and leveled itself off and flew off. It's not going to happen in a second or third generation jet. So those type of stuff, at the end of it, by the end of the whole exercise, I realized that I was able to put a bit of input into this whole exercise. In fact, to the extent with Diogo, I said to him, I'll write this stuff down because this is what I think could be problems. There's another thing called a ram's horn vortex. Now, I don't know if that even affects these fourth generation, but in a thing like a Hunter, when you're doing ground attack or high G, because at one stage, one of the my last flight, Elaine, the other Hunter pilot, when we pulled into a turn, the Hunter actually turns best when it just starts to burble, not in a stall, but it just the wing is starting to depart, but it's still enough to actually increase your turn. And when we landed, he said, you know, I wonder if you could get yourself in a bad situation if you pulled too hard. And that's when I remembered another thing that we did in the Air Force we were very conscious of, is in a dive for a ground attack, which these guys won't do. But as you're going, if you're accelerating, you get this vortex off the end of the wing, okay? And as you pull, the vortex will increase. Pulling. If you pull too hard, the vortex is so powerful, there's almost a vacuum in the back of the wing, back of the main plane. And you get another huge vortex which comes over the top onto the back of the main plane, and it'll send you straight to 7G at least and more, probably past limits. That type of thing, you know, you've got to be conscious of. And I just mentioned these things, and Diogo said, I'm going to put them in the book, because those are the type of things, if the blokes haven't thought about it down the way, it might be of interest. So I was able to probably impart a little bit of my knowledge along the way, and they accepted it, which is wonderful. You know, for the coming from that sort of fraternity, it was good. It was really good. Yeah. Anyway, so yeah, I'm just waiting now to see if they give me my endorsement for South Africa. Perhaps I'll go fly the Hunter again. Yeah, which would be fun. Yeah, well, that's about as much as I've got to talk about with my Canadian experience. That's probably more than you needed, but it was a wonderful experience. And once again, Chris, just at this stage of my life, it's actually been, and I've had all sorts of operations, mainly through bicycle accidents and that type of stuff, and to be able to get back in and do it without and feeling completely comfortable. In fact, it went on as the flights went on. I felt obviously more and more comfortable because I flew it a little bit. The one thing that did come out of it is that I didn't have instruments in front of me, and they let me do a circuit. It was just to try and look at his instruments on that side and keep the speeds in it. It was so I did mention at one stage, because all they can do is make a switch selection and the instrument jumps from there to the front. Like in the 737, the modern ones 800 after you could just make switch selections and you can switch all these instruments all over the cockpit, And so they might do that as well. So at least the guy on the right hand side could fly if he had to, not that it would be a normal requirement. Yeah. Yeah.
Brilliant, Cheapers. That was just absolutely enthralling, Steve. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I was furiously writing notes because it's such a rich and wonderful story you shared with us today. I'm just trying to chronologically put my thoughts in order, and I thought to kind of segue back to the Rhodesian experience.
Yeah.
And you referenced the Rhodesian Air Force didn't operate the T model, the trainer model. They only had the single, and I think they were FGA 9s. Do you have any sort of knowledge as to what drove the decision not to invest in 2-seat trainers?
Actually, I think I'm not even sure they had a 2-seat trainer when they got the Hunter. They got the Hunters in 63. And I'm not quite sure when they started the T7, when they got the T7. It was later in the life, and also they converted a lot of the Mark IVs, which predates the 9. They converted a lot of those to 2-seaters. Up until about 1960, the Hunters, they started making the FGA 9, but then they started selling them overseas, and they were making so much money out of these aircraft that they were starting to get all these Mark IVs with the small engine single-seaters from around the world, from India and Holland and Denmark, Sweden, and they converted them into FGA 9s. And that's actually in the Rhodesian one at that stage. And I think ours were part of this. We were sort of one of the earlier buyers of the reconditioned ones. But I'm not even sure about the 2-seater. But the other thing about it, though, in our Air Force, Chris, we tended to fly everything. And so what would generally happen is that the guy would go from he's training on the Vampire, stay on the Vampire for a while. He might then go and fly Provis in the bush, whatever it was, and we come back with generally a flight lieutenant. So they're talking about a captain with a lot of experience, and then the Hunter's easy to fly. We had a very comprehensive training and a very good simulator. Not a horrible thing to fly, but it was a good trainer for emergencies and that type of stuff. And as I say, most guys went straight, did a lot of flying before they came back to the Hunter. And in my previous interview, I meant we weren't very popular, my friend Baldy and I, because we came straight off our wings at OCU. We did with the weapons conversion, we went straight to the Hunter. And it was very unpopular decision amongst all the pilots because, what are these guys doing? And what we didn't realize at the time is that they were going to be sending guys down to the Mirage. And the whole story behind that, the quick story behind that was that the South Africans had the early model, the 3Cs, which was the really good dogfighter, which the Israelis used. And then they got the 3E about a couple of years later. And when they were due to get another fighter, they went for the F1. And the idea being, when they got the F1s, we would then take the C models back to Rhodesia. And with politics and that didn't happen. But they wanted a depth of experience. So the first guys went down to the Mirage were quite experienced and flight lieutenants. And then I went down with Garrity. He was actually a flight lieutenant as well, I think. But I went down with a single stripe. And the whole object was trying to give us this depth of experience. But it was difficult for myself and Baldy, the other guy who went straight on the Hunter, because I had a total of 300 hours at that stage. And the Hunter, when I took off, I was sitting on the pail somewhere. I hadn't no idea what was going on. And the way we did the training off that was we then flew with another guy quite often. And the chap I quite flew with was Rick Kalpen, very well-known guy who became a test pilot in South Africa on the Cheetah and that type of thing. Unfortunately, he passed away in a crash. But that's how we did our training. But yeah, as I said, if with experience, getting a Hunter was no problem. And that's maybe part of their thinking, or possibly they just couldn't get a two-seater at that stage. Yeah.
Thank you. You've answered a question that's always sort of been in the back of my mind for many years, why that was. So much obliged. The other question I thought also with your military service, how did you find that transition from going from subsonic, from the Hawker Hunter to the Mirage 3? Was it really challenging or difficult?
No, it wasn't. The aircraft by that stage were designed to go through. In fact, the Hunter was only really a transonic aircraft, but we got one from Kenya when I was my last 6 months in the Air Force, and I cleaned it all up, and I actually got it supersonic in a bit of a dive. And when you went supersonic, it's a tick in the box. You can see the gauge goes supersonic, and the rudder on the Hunter just burbled a bit. But we used, I don't know if you remember from my previous interview, we used it as a weapon, the supersonic boom. You remember? So we'd go out into the bush, and our guys weren't quite as harsh as the other guys, the bad guys. They used to cut off people's arms and bits of their body, and what our guys used to try and encourage them for information. And the one was, if you don't tell us what we want to know, Tagati's going to come in. And we get out with that, take a dirty dive at the ground and get up to transonic, and you get this boom, and apparently all sorts of information came in. So we used it as a weapon as well. When we went to the Mirage was the same again. It was no difference at all. All you knew you'd gone supersonic was if you were level, the speed with the height would drop 800 feet. That's just the pressure wave going over the top of the pitot head. And then as you went through, it'll come up again. The one time it was noticeable quite difficult on instrument flying. We used to have to go, part of instrument flying, we had to go supersonic. Now the shock waves all move about at that stage. And then once we were supersonic, I think we got up to 1.2, we'd have to go into a level turn and pull until you went subsonic. And somewhere through that, the center of pressure would suddenly move forward, and you get a bit of a pitch up, which you had to control. But that was just, that was because we were supersonic, and it was not, didn't affect us in our normal flight. That was just for instrument flying. In fact, what we used to do, because we couldn't go supersonic below 30,000 feet inland, we used to go do our weapons, our ACM dogfighting in Durban. And at that stage, we could go whatever speed we wanted to, down to 5,000 feet, which we called a hard deck. And if we had to go supersonic, so be it. But it didn't seem to affect the flying in any shape or form. It just means we could accelerate that much better, type of thing. If we had pulled too hard, it might have been uncomfortable. But no, they were designed to go supersonic by that stage. Even we went and did our Mark II flight. All that was a tick in the box, just to say you've been twice the speed of sound. And it did it quite happily. There wasn't much control at the end of that because everything was at the back. All the waves were at the back, but it was just a tick in the box to say you've been twice the speed of sound at the end of the day. In fact, even these aircraft, I've got a Mark II badge, and I met the Gripen pilot, who's that's what they've got in South Africa now, and he was doing his test training, the flight test training, and I said to him, "Oh, you got a Mark II badge?" He said, "No, the Gripen doesn't go Mark II." So he hasn't got a badge. And then he goes 1.8 or something. Yeah.
Oh, fascinating. Thank you. Now, I heard a rumor, I don't know if this is true, but I have heard it said that the Mirage 3 engine, the Snecmar Atar, particularly the early versions, the ones that were on the Mirage 3s, could be a little temperamental and need a little TLC. Did you have any bad experiences with engine issues on the Mirage 3?
One of my friends did. In fact, in a lot of ways, it was a lot simpler than the Hunter engine. We had all sorts of variable guide vanes and valves closing and everything. Not in the Mirage 3. Once again, I think we briefed so well on flying at low speeds. That's when you had a problem. A friend of mine had a flame out once on a Mirage 3, just getting in a departure, and everything. It sounded like the whole kitchen sink was falling out the back of the aircraft. But as soon as you got the nose down, got the speed up, it started again. But I think, once again, perhaps our training, because it just made us aware of where you were with this thing. I listened quite a lot to the Australians. They had a lot of problem with their Mirages, and they lost 40 of them, through accidents. A lot of it's to do with the Australians themselves, having to put a lot of Australian content on aircraft, which doesn't help because the French can't help you if you actually put your own content. I think that was part of it. But stories, I flew with a guy, I trained a guy in QANTAS. He was training I was training a captain. And when we got talking about what we flew, he said, yeah, I started training there in the Mirage. And he said, after 2 flights, I said, no, I'm not going to fly this airplane. It's too fast and it's too dangerous. So, I don't remember that sort of thing. But you have to be careful with it. That's what I'm trying to say. And we were taught very well how to look after ourselves, I think, yeah.
Thanks, Steve. It's interesting you referred to the Australian experience, because what actually prompted the question from me is I am quite aware that they had a horrific attrition rate on the Mirage 3. But I did notice that, I know it's a smaller fleet, but I did notice that the attrition rate on South Africa's Mirage 3 is very, very low. So, yeah, I was just interested to hear your views. And, if there's any Mirage 3 Royal Australian Air Force pilots viewing this, please, no disrespect at all, not intended.
No, actually, I have to mention at this stage, because having flown a lot with F-18, mainly F-18 pilots when I was with Qantas, their training is very, very. For example, when you pass a pilot's course in Rhodesia or South Africa, that's your ticket. You then go on and send you wherever you want to go. And if you get your Mirages, you just do a Mirage conversion and you're a Mirage pilot. Not in Australia. You do your initial OCU, whatever. You want to go to fighter pilot, you then got to go to their training establishment. And there people up to 30% fail. It's a very tough environment that they fly in, this Australia. I met the chappie Koos de Villiers. He was an engineer, you want to call him a scientist, a South African scientist engineer. And he was employed to try and fix up the wings on the Mirages. And he found that they were really, really overstressed. They really pushed things hard in the Australian Air Force compared to perhaps what we did in the South African Air Force. And whether that be right or wrong, whatever it is, but that's what part of it. But also I blame the politicians again, well, the manufacturer, they wanted to have the Australian content. Whenever you start you're filling with airplanes, you've got another problem. The Germans found that when they put an extra ton of equipment on them F-104s, that's probably half the reason they lost 200 of them along the way. You've got to sort of keep things in its context. But they do. These guys fly the aircraft well. The beauty about I found, which was really nice, flying with the Australians in Qantas, I found their pilots surprisingly humble, the fighter pilots. You always hear the story about the knuckleheads, and they have a wonderful sense of social. They get on well together. As long as the fighter pilots have a lovely social experience with themselves. But these guys I found in Australia, of course, were very, 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 very professional, very qualified, and humble. If you're just easy guys to get on with, which rather surprised me. No.
I think on a personal note, I think the jet jocks do get a bad reputation, but I have a very strong sneaky suspicion, and I have some background evidence to support this, that a lot of the myth is perpetrated by the loose wing pilots who seem to like to wind up the jet jocks. And I know Fossey has from time to time made reference to that as well. So I certainly take your lead or view that they're probably not as bad as loose wing pilots would like to make out.
I call it jealousy, Chris.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you. The other part of the conversation today, which is just massively intriguing, is that experience at London Airport near Toronto in Canada. What a remarkable story. I had to ask you, when you mentioned the change in the avionic layout of the cockpit with the 5th gen, how did you find that transition? Was it quite difficult, or did you slot in relatively easy?
For me, it wasn't a problem because I was sitting on the right-hand side and I didn't have the instrumentation and everything. When I got to fly it, it was just like flying a Hunter, really. I found the controls, from what I remembered, a little bit firmer than I remembered from the FGA-9 that I flew, if I could say that. But then I flew a circuit, and it was just a hunter. I mean, the guys in the left-hand seat had no concept of what the original was like, because all they'd ever seen was the modern cockpit. So from their aspect, it was no different. They were used to flying with glass cockpits as well. So if anything, if I sat in that seat, I probably would. No, I'm used to flying the 737-800. So the instrumentation is very similar. Everything's on one screen, and you can move it around. So no, I didn't find that. I wouldn't have found that, even sitting in the left seat, I wouldn't have found it difficult at all, I don't think. Yeah, because it's a lot easier to fly the modern cockpit than it is the old analog cockpit anyway. Much easier, because all instruments are all on the one screen basically, instead of having to look all the way around. No, there wasn't a problem at all.
Fascinating. I was really impressed. You rattled off quite a list of foreign trainee test pilots there. And I remember you mentioning an Israeli fellow being there as well. And I know Koos is often mentioned on the channel that the degree of competency and ability and skill level of the Israelis is particularly high. So I think that certainly is a great testament to ITPS that they've got Israelis attending on those courses.
Well, the Israeli didn't have Israeli trainee pilots, just an instructor pilot for helicopter. So
I beg your pardon. Okay.
So he's probably retired from the Israeli Air Force. Yeah, the Israelis, and I put these personally, I put the Israelis up at the top of any fighter pilot in the world, and because we operated with them. I think in my previous interview I mentioned that we had after the Yom Kippur War, we had a whole bunch of Phantom pilots come across, and it may be one of the reasons we didn't get the Mirage as well, because that the Mirage 3C is the one that did all the damage in the 6-day war. And they apparently they saw us in our Rhodesian uniforms walking around, and they said, "What are these guys doing?" They said, "Oh, we're going to keep giving you our whole airplanes to the Rhodesians." They said, "You're crazy. Those are your best dogfighters you've got." And that was the part of the story. But what came out of that as well is that they flew 25 hours of dogfighting a month. They didn't do any other training. They felt if they were dogfighting, they could cope with anything. Instrument flying, air-to-ground flying, whatever it was. They just used to go up and dogfight. And I could go into long stories about that, because if they went to a fight, we always had this, when I was at that stage, mutual support. We didn't have tail warning radars and all this sort of thing, Hunter. So we used to have to look after each other's tails. And with them, they did the same sort of thing. But invariably, they would go to a fight with 2 of them against 10. And they would then have to obviously do individual maneuvering, but they would still be watching each other and commentating when they got better on the ground. Now, they would just shoot down their guy, and they would watch the other guy. You should have shot that. You should have shot that guy before you did, because you did this and that. That's how skilled they were, I came across that with a chap called Major Dick Lord. You've probably heard the name, Dick Lord? Yes. Well, he was. I called him my mentor, because I went my very first flight in the Mirage. I went up in the back seat with him, and we were the bogey, so we were the attacker. Now, the bogey should never win a fight. We shouldn't lose, because you should always have enough energy to get out of the fight. But and the other guys, if he kept the speed down, the other guys should be able to sandwich him. But we won 3 fights straight in a row. And when we got back in the ground, he was able to disseminate each aspect of that flight. I had no clue what was going on all the time, because we were just going around the sky in circles. But that's the sort of guy Dick Lord was. He wrote the unit orders for Top Gun School. Yeah, and a lovely guy. I used to meet him before he passed away in Cape Town to go and have a coffee with him. Just a lovely, lovely guy.
I should just add to your very kind comments about Colonel Lord. I can only 100% concur. And I'm sure anybody who's watching this today, you would feel exactly the same way about Dick Lord. So just very briefly segue, I was an ops int officer up at Sector 10 in Oshakati, and he was my OC, Colonel Dick Lord.
Okay. Yeah.
And one of my most sort of really memorable moments was one afternoon. It was fairly quiet, and he got a few of us into the briefing room we had on the side. Then he took us through a slideshow of a visit he made. I don't know if it was during his time with the Fleet Aerom or a trip he'd made to the museum, but he took us through this wonderful presentation on different Fleet Aerom aircraft and on aircraft in the Royal Navy Fleet Aerom museum at Yeovilton, which was just amazing. But he was the greatest boss ever. Wonderful guy. And of course, I've read the book Fledgling to Eagle.
Yes.
And just to build on your point, I do note in a couple of photographs in that book, there are some squadron photographs where there are Israeli pilots in there.
Okay.
And they're not referred to by name. It just says Israeli. But yeah, that's all good.
He told me a story as well, because he flew the F1 up in southwest there. He got hold of a Cuban, a MiG-23 pilot, and they started corresponding as mates after the war. And there was just a lovely story of warriors, respect for each other and that type of thing. Yeah, he actually ended up as obviously a brigadier general, I think he was. And one of the conversations, and this has come up as well, because I've actually been trying, Georgia was quite keen to get a Mirage, and I was quite keen for him to get a Mirage, because if you got a Mirage two-seater, the Canadians will require a pilot to sit in the back seat who's flown a Mirage 3. So guess who that might be?
That sounds like a terrible idea, doesn't it?
Anyway, there's some 3 two-seaters that I flew are still in South Africa. One's in an open hangar at Swartkorps, well looked after. There's one inside the museum at Swartkorps, and there's the one at Hoedspruit. And I was trying to see if somehow we can get one of those, but it's not going to happen, I don't think. But because he was told by the new administration that they don't care anything about history before. But thankfully, there's a bloke, Colonel Tony Smith, and he's got a group of volunteers who are keeping an eye on them, thankfully. And younger people are joining. I've got a guy contact me the other day and said no, because I was worried that when the old generation will pass on, that'll be the end of them. But there's a guy's just left school. He's got a whole bunch of young kids involved in looking after them. So that's good news. It really bugs me, because I've written stories about this, in my book and everything, is that these aircraft, people love their cars, their fast cars and their boats and their trains, whatever it is, and they look lovely and they just sit on the ground. These things of ours, they weigh 20 tons. You get airborne, they can go twice the speed of sound. They're the military hardware that look after your country, man, more than anything else. And when they finish, they seem to just dump them, and that really bugs me. I feel there should be respect, especially Israelis. I got hold of them once because I saw one of their old Mirages or Neshes, whatever they were, looking really sad and stuff. I said, that thing's won your wars for you, And some guy said, it's a pilot. I said, yeah, it needs a good airplane and a pilot, a good airplane to fly as well. So I feel very strongly about maintaining our airplanes, once they finish flying.
I think most viewers, regardless of your background, being Air Force or not, would probably tend to support that, because it is, it is history, live history. And the thing, I guess, with that is once it's gone, you won't get it back. So I think your point's very well made. I did want to make another point, not a point, but a question I wanted to put to you. You mentioned you still keep your hand in on loose wings on helicopters. And I think you referenced flying a Bell 47 down in Tasmania. I had to ask you, how do you find flying that? Because that's a pretty old aircraft.
It's wonderful, our airplane. It's a good, solid machine. My friend down there, he's a wealthy guy, and became really good friends with him. He flies a helicopter from the middle of town. He's a Croatian, so once again, a Balkan with lots of character and lots of money, and he's got 2 of them, and he doesn't fly them very much. And I work with children in the STEM program, which is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and I go and speak in schools. And so I used to take the helicopter. We go land in the schoolyard or the sports field and go and talk. And it's a lovely airplane to fly. I've flown them for a long time. It's a bit like it's a Jeep, it's solid, it's big engine, hard to fly because you haven't got auto control on the throttle, on the collective. You've got to actually wind it up like a motorbike type of thing. So it's quite difficult to keep it all together. But I really liked the airplane. He also had a R-44, and not in the same league at all. I mean, it's a completely different airplane. The R-44 is good for what it does. It's cheap to operate, whereas the 47 is quite expensive. But he loves them, so I get to fly them, which is fun. I did quite a bit of instruction in Zimbabwe on them as well, for crop Australian pilots. So now you're talking about teaching a bloke to fly an airplane which is overweight. So you can't even hover it. You've got to take off on the skid and then build up your power as you go. So that was interesting. Lovely airplane.
Thanks for that. We did have to pay just a little bit of homage to the loose wing to helicopters, else there'll be a whole lot of complaints on the site from helicopter pilots saying we're not doing justice to it. So we've parked that, so that's really good.
We
I was
never had
also
that. Well, we never had that problem in Rhodesia because we flew everything. Even blokes are flying helicopters and fixed wing. It's only when I got to Australia we got this funny attitude between helicopter pilots and fixed wing pilots. I find it quite odd.
it would be a very rampant South African cultural value. Certainly in my days in the Air Force, it was very easy to observe it, but it was always good humor, I think.
So much.
You mentioned, just coming back to your experience in Canada, going back onto the Hunter. Talk us through just sort of, in a normal test flight scenario like that, obviously you're checking controls on the aircraft. What other steps and things are you doing to ensure the aircraft is in a position to do what it's supposed to be able to?
Bear in mind that a lot of testing is done before we even get airborne. A lot of it is done before I even got there. As I said, they mentioned the taxi and everything, and all the controls. And every time, anytime the aircraft is ground run or anything like that, they would be checking controls. In fact, even to the extent now, more so than the Air Force, before we flew, every time, you had to move all the controls, the dive brakes, the flaps, and everything, and the technician would be monitoring what you were doing and giving you indications of where they were. In the Air Force, we just used to start up and basically just taxi out. But here, they're checking everything all the time. So a lot of, and also remember, it's been on jacks, and they would be testing all that sort of stuff on the jacks. And so from the technical aspect, the hardware, it wasn't a problem. What we were mainly testing when we got airborne was the new stuff, the speed. We confirmed that the speed of the aircraft was the same as the chase plane along the way. And the warning, we did quite a bit of on the warnings on our aircraft. For example, if you put let's say, if you brought the throttle back too far on the Legacy Hunter, a little light came on down the bottom where you couldn't even see it somewhere. But now on the master caution panel, the light would come up. Also, approaching the stall, you'd get a stall warning, which we never had in the Legacy Hunter. And some of the speeds weren't quite right. So when we came up to the stall, we'd be with the chase plane, and I'd be marking down what that speed was, that the stall warning. And when we first started, the stall warning came on too early. So when he landed on the ground, all the guys went, all the electronics guys went and tweaked them. So from the hardware side of it, we didn't expect any problems from the undercarriage and all that sort of stuff. It was just the software stuff that was going to be the main testing that we were doing. And that was in the first flight. The second flight, we tended to make sure that I tell you, we had to go inverted. No, that was the third flight. And go inverted, make sure the fuel didn't stop flying. The engine didn't stop while we were inverted. Pulling G to make sure it didn't affect any of these new DC instruments type of thing. What was quite interesting, towards the end, I think, the last flight I did with Tiago, the cockpit got really hot. And he'd been fiddling down here with this. I told you about this the sort of the manual control. And when we landed, we just assumed there was a problem. So we had a long chat about it, and then we went up. I went up the lane, the other guy, and we on instruction from the engineers. He said, "Don't just move it a little bit, move it and leave it and see what happens." And that's exactly what was the problem. So when we go back, we had a long chat about it with the engineers. I was chatting with a few of the guys, the electronics guys, and it's a valve which opens and closes to have hot or cold. And we just decided that we'd come up with an indicator now, so you could actually move the controls to where the temperature should be, leave it there, and eventually it'll sort itself out. And that was just one of the problems going from an AC to a DC machine. You just had to work things out for itself. And once again, it was all in-house, which is amazing. The guys had done all themselves. So that's why part of it I enjoyed being there. In fact, Tiago said to me was, I've never come across a pilot who spends so much time with his engineers. Just anytime I had off, I used to go and chat with the guys, and talk about what was going on.
And obviously you've got a very solid background, a mechanical background, because before you flew, that was your role. Do you think that gave you maybe a bit of an edge in coming up to speed in your training as a pilot, as a fighter pilot?
No, I'll tell you one aspect of it, just a bit of a joke, is that when I was a technician on the Hunter, you've got a radar range, you've got a ranging on the throttle. So when you go into a dogfight and you put the aircraft, the actual sight on the aircraft, to get its wings right, you've got to wind up this throttle thing. And it works in a little relay down the back behind the seat. And every time the pilots come down and say it doesn't work, so I just take a screwdriver and just beat it, and after that it worked again. So when I went on as a pilot, I used to always fly with the same screwdriver. If it didn't work, I just beat it again. I knew exactly where to hit it, you know. But going back to what you're saying, they said, I don't think it really helped. I don't think it does help much. What really helped was working in the flight simulator, because the Hunter simulator, I told you, was an actual dog of a machine, and the pilots hated it. But it was good for emergencies and that type of thing. But I actually, with my last year as a technician, I flew it a lot because, and I think I mentioned my last talk as well, I had a very astute boss. This was an old valve machine. So all these valves were your amplifiers, you know, and we used to have to service them, take them out and take these valves and check them. But as soon as you did that and you didn't put them in there properly, it wouldn't work. So invariably, after a good day's servicing, half the stuff didn't work. So my boss said, we're not going to do that. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. And if something went wrong, we'd find it and fix it. So we used to make hamburgers all day. They did. I used to fly the Hunter. And that certainly helped, without a doubt. In fact, some guy came up after I'd done a talk, one of the talks, he said to me, Steve went straight from being a Hunter simulator pilot to being a Hunter pilot. It wasn't quite that simple, but I'm pretty sure it helped a lot. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you so much, Steve. The other question I had for you, looking at the Australian aviation scene, are there any working or flyable Hunters in Australia today?
There's one, the one I talked about, the one I flew 20 years ago. There's a whole English outfit that came out because they can't fly the Hunters in England anymore. So a wealthy guy has bought that two-seater, and that's supposedly flying down the sail. I was supposed to be involved, but thankfully, well, now I'm thankful I wasn't, because I've gone from, anyway, that's a long story. But there's supposedly going to be some Hunters flying there, and some on the East Coast, yeah. Sort of the same thing they're probably going to do in the States with it.
Yeah, and I think on that point, we can probably look forward to seeing you do some more work in that space, flying, hopefully, bringing your expertise and skill to play.
Yeah, I think they've got quite a bit there, but the whole, because of course the English are flying their Hunters and they've been flying them for a long time. So it's a whole English operation. I'm just hoping the same thing comes up with the South African one, if it does come up. And I win the lottery and buy my own one.
I guess that was the next question I had for you, which is, when are you going to invest in one? But I guess, as you say, that's
when I bought mine, the whole object was that while my friend was building his, I would build a piggyback with my single-seater. But I wasn't going to use the family money. I could probably have afforded it, but it's just a big hole that you throw money into. And that's what we found. Even with him, it was a sort of stop-start, because it's an expensive exercise, and especially when you get to the fuel side of it as well. Now, I'm very happy with what's happened. I've restored a Hunter. Well, I've got a Hunter that's going to live forever. They've actually making a big model of a Rhodesian Hunter, my one that was shot down in the war. That's going to sit next to it. And I've also, my career board, all my badges I've collected will sit on a wall behind that as well. So it's a bit of present, because I've got a whole bunch of, my house is full of girls. I think my career board would end up in a tip somewhere at some stage. So that was good. Yeah. Yes.
Fabulous. Hey, it's been absolutely intriguing and fascinating having a chat with you today. Steve, thank you so much for sharing your insights.
Chris, one thing that, when I spoke to Koos last time, he wanted me to ask you, he wanted me to speak about a bit about John Boyd. Did he mention
Yes, if you have time, certainly.
If you're happy, I'm happy. Yeah.
Absolutely. Please go ahead.
Do you know the story behind him at all, John Boyd?
No, but I'm sure it would be good to share, not just with me, but with all of our viewers. All the audience would like to hear.
Yeah, it's you don't hear about him very much. He's probably the architect of air combat maneuvers. I've got his book, and it's an interesting book to read. He was a military strategist and mathematician, obviously a very, very bright guy, but also a very abrasive personality. And I think that's probably what put him off people. He called himself the 42nd Boyd. The 42nd Boyd meant he could beat any pilot within 40 seconds in a dogfight. And he flew in Korea. He actually flew F1. I think he flew the Sabre, the F-86, and also the F-100, the Super Sabre. And I remember him talking about it was because that wasn't an easy aircraft to fly, and he learned to do a deceleration like you saw a bit in Top Gun, where the guy, he could do that in the F-100, and of course someone would go straight past him, and then he'd recover from that. But what he did, he mathematically worked out air combat maneuvers. Now, in a dogfight, you've got these maneuvers which you probably hear about: the lower speed yo-yo, the high speed yo-yo, the barrel roll attack, all that sort of stuff. And I'm assuming that all came from there because he actually went into a computer and worked out the way to get around all this sort of stuff. As I understand it, if you're going back prior to the Korean War, if you went into a fighter squadron, if you were lucky enough to get a guy who was ready to impart his knowledge, you would go up and fly with him, and he would show you how he did dogfighting and that type of thing, and the different maneuvers. So prior to Boyd doing that, that's the way they operated. And it's interesting to note that blokes like the blonde knight of Germany, I forget his name, Hartmann, his name is, I think it was the name, he got 350 kills. Interesting to know that if he went in, he would only attack if the opponent hadn't seen him. So if he went into an attack and the opponent saw him and started turning towards him, he would get out of the attack. He wasn't going to try not, although he'd get shot down many times, but he would avoid getting into a dogfight. He just wanted to go and shoot them down. And I think I read somewhere that 80% of all people shot down never saw the attacker. 80%. So when Boyd came along now, and he introduced these maneuvers like the high speed yo-yo, the low speed yo-yo, the barrel roll attack, the brake, and all that type of stuff. And we used that, and that's how we learned. We got our notes in the SAAF Air Force from the Australians, who'd got the Mirage before we did, before SAAFings did, and our notes are all based, dogfight notes are all based on Australian notes, and probably coming from Boyd along the way. But he went a step further because he was a bright guy. He got involved in the design of the F-15 and the F-16. And his whole object in that design was that aircraft to be dogfighters, air combat dogfighters. And they didn't end up that way. They ended up as mud movers, is what Dick George would say. And the reason for that, his perception of that, was that the generals in Pentagon were making so much money from kickbacks from the contractors of these missiles, both air-to-air missiles and air-to-ground missiles, that's why they changed their whole. That's why it made him so unpopular. Obviously, you don't read much about John Boyd at all. Any occasionally you come across a guy, and I'm talking about fighters, I mentioned John Boyd, very occasionally, and yet he's the architect of air combat. In fact, he had admiration for the Russians, because when the Russians built a dogfighter, they kept it a dogfighter. They didn't make it a mud mover, and all this multi-role stuff that's going on. You know? So that was, and then they mentioned that. Then there was the other thing. He got very involved in war. He followed that famous Chinese guy. I forget his name, but he got his whole concept of war. I didn't get too stuck into that. But he talked about the OODA loop. You've heard of the OODA loop?
No, do enlighten us on that.
That is his big thing, was the OODA loop. And the OODA loop, it's basically means to observe, orientate, decide, and act. So, and it's actually, it's just a circle I've got down the bottom here, basically. So the first thing to do is when you go into combat, you observe the situation. So your whole picture of what's going on. And then you've got to now orientate yourself what you're going to do. So I look at myself, and I just love dogfighting F-16 against a MiG-29 on my screen here. And every fight is different that I go into. So you got the guy coming in. You've got to see the first thing is to observe, to see where he's coming from, what sort of speed he might be doing. But I don't like the missile side, I just do the guns. And then from then, you've got to orientate to make sense of the information you've got. So he's going to be coming fast. He seems to be outside my turn. What should I do now? So that's you orientate and then decide. So this time I can see he's going, the speed's going quite high. So I'm going to go up with him to get performance sort of behind him, whatever it is, and then act. From that aspect, I can then attack him. And he said it's not only reading on this now, it's for, people use it in business now. It's a perception of, instead of just going in at it, is to observe and see what's going on in the business meeting, for example, and then orientate to see from which aspect you can approach it. And that was his OODA route. And he said you can then go back anytime you want to and start again, observe again, and then orientate, decide, and then act. So that was his concept. Whenever you hear John Wood, you often hear about this OODA route. There's a lot more to it because he was a very, very complex character, I think, at the end of the day. But he had some very good people who admired him and followed him and helped him, but some very antagonistic people as well. Obviously, the ones who were stepping on in their toes, I guess.
I think it's a fascinating insight around that. And I was actually, funnily enough, as you were mentioning that those 4 decisive points, I was actually thinking, gosh, that actually does have merit and application in a business environment. And funny enough, I was thinking that as well. So that was quite useful. I think he may have been referencing Jin Su, I think it is, The Art of War. But it sounds like a fascinating individual human being. I can well understand how someone with that A-type personality would rub up a few old crusty generals the wrong way. But good on him for doing it, because obviously his lessons have been well learned and have been applied throughout the ages. And I think the Americans took some lessons out of that towards the tail end of the Vietnam experience, as they referred back to those dogfighting skills. And just to segue back, I remembered your comment you made earlier where Colonel Dick Lord, who was running the Fleet Heron, I believe, also did quite a bit of work in assisting with the formation of Top Gun, I believe, with some of the programs that were applied.
Absolutely. In fact, there's a Colonel Rucconi. I always quote him as well, because what happened in Vietnam, of course, the whole story was that they went and they were assuming the missiles were going to shoot the aircraft down, and they didn't. This was mainly the Navy. And so they eventually put guns back on, and that's what Top Gun started, to train the guys to dogfight again, because they weren't dogfighting. And the kill ratio in Korea was 10-1, and in Vietnam was 1-1. So until they started dogfighting at Top Gun, they weren't. And thereafter, even today there's never going to be a dogfight. Most unlikely. And I don't know how you would get inside the modern missile to be able to dogfight, but they still recommend that they continue dogfight to keep the aggressive spirit going and to be able to handle the aircraft. Just bearing in mind what the Israelis said, they just dogfight. They don't do anything else, basically. So even today, with a thing like an F-35, you can pick up, I don't know how many targets, 10 targets at 80 miles and start firing at 30 miles. You don't have to ever see the enemy, but you still need that aggressive spirit to dogfight. In fact, the poor old F-35 is taking a bit of a knock, because if they go and dogfight against an F-16, quite often the F-16 will win in the dogfight, because it's a maneuvering aircraft. Whereas a poor old F-35, even though it won't dogfight probably as well as an F-16, but it'll take on the F-16 and 30 way twice the distance of the missile. And he's got 4 of them sitting inside, along the way. So I think it's quite harsh to blame the F-35, because it's a brilliant aircraft, apparently, by all accounts.
Yes, it's interesting. I was interested on your point on that. I suppose the flip side of the equation is once those 4 missiles are gone, it's a question of what now. And I do understand the F-35. I'm not sure if the naval version has it, but I know the A model has an internal gun, which obviously is a reflection that still put value on that dogfighting ability.
Absolutely. Yeah, and coming back to the dogfight again as well, it depends a lot on the pilot. I mean, even dissimilar, it depends a lot on the pilot. And once again, if you're doing the training, it's going to make a huge amount of difference at the end of the day. So you might take an F-35 against a very qualified Israeli F-35 pilot taking on a less qualified other pilot, an F-16, he would take him out, Yeah, but also going back to the missiles, I think if they ran out of 4 missiles, they'd probably go home. That's
That sounds like a very wise policy based on someone who has years of experience and knows what they're talking about. So thank
well,
you.
that came back to Hartman as well. He wouldn't attack a bloke who'd seen him, you know. He'd pull out and go home and come back and do it again sometimes.
Yeah, and I think, look, the other part of that testament on Eric Hartman is the fact of the matter, you know, as you say, I think he got about 350 kills. But the important thing is he got out of it alive, which obviously is a good indication that the man had a really good situational awareness and a strategy and applied it. So I think that's a great lesson. But I must tell you, Steve, we've kind of segued into air combat, and I'm really glad we have, because the real brilliant thing is I've now got, Koos and I now have a good reason to come back and get you back, because what we'd like to do in the near future is we're thinking about hosting a discussion panel. We'd love to include you and some other ex-South African Air Force fighter pilots. And we want to talk shared experience, and in particular around dogfighting. So we won't be letting you go, unfortunately. But folks, we are been close on 2 hours. I hope you feel as excited and you've enjoyed this conversation as much as I have with Steve. It's been just brilliant. Make sure if you've got questions, please post them below. I'm sure Steve will do the very best he can to get back to you with replies. So we welcome your comments. And just a personal little note from Koos. Guys, if you can afford it, please do help support us through Patreon. Your $5 really, it makes a big difference to enable us to actually bring you these stories. And just finally, in closing, Steve, thank you again. It's been wonderful, and we look forward to talking with you again soon. Goodbye, Internet. God bless.
Thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, and ring the bell to receive notifications.